insisted that each sovereignty should by means of nullification protect itself. It was a long step in advance when the nation conquered the prerogative of asserting its own sovereign power through the Supreme Court. Now the intervention of the courts in legislation has become, by the change in environment, as fatal to administration as would have been in 1800 the success of nullification. I find it difficult to believe that capital, with its specialized views of what constitutes its advantages, its duties and its responsibilities, and stimulated by a bar molded to meet its prejudices and requirements, will ever voluntarily assent to the consolidation of the United States to the point at which the interference of the courts with legislation might be eliminated, because, as I have pointed out, capital finds the judicial veto useful as a means of at least temporarily evading the law, while the bar, taken as a whole, quite honestly, believes that the universe will obey the judicial decree. No delusion could be profounder, and none perhaps more dangerous. Courts, I need hardly say, cannot control nature, though by trying to do so they may, like the Parliament of Paris, create a friction which shall induce an appalling catastrophe. True, judicial courts, whether in times of peace or of revolution, seldom fail to be a substantial protection to the weak, because they enforce an established corpus juris, and conduct trials by recognized forms. It is startling to compare the percentage of convictions to prosecutions for the same class of offenses in the regular criminal courts during the French Revolution with the percentage in the Revolutionary Tribunal. And once a stable social equilibrium is reached, all men tend to support judicial courts, if judicial courts exist, from an instinct of self-preservation. This has been amply shown by French experience, and it is here that French history is so illuminating to the American mind. Before the Revolution, France had semi-political courts which conduced to the overthrow of Turgot and therefore wrought for violence. But more than this, France, under the old regime, had evolved a legal profession of a cast of mind incompatible with an equal administration of the law. The French courts were therefore, when trouble came, supported only by a faction, and were cast aside. With that the old regime fell. The young Duke of Chartres, the son of Égalité Orleans and the future Louis Philippe, has related in his journal an anecdote which illustrates that subtle poison of distrust which undermines all legal authority the moment that suspicion of political partiality in the judiciary enters the popular mind. In June 1791 the Duke went down from Paris to Vendôme to join the regiment of dragoons of which he had been commissioned colonel. One day, soon after he joined, a messenger came to him in haste to tell him that a mob had gathered near by who were about to hang two priests. "I ran thither at once," wrote the Duke. "I spoke to those who seemed most excited and impressed upon them how horrible it was to hang men without trial. Besides, to act as hangmen was to enter a trade which they all thought infamous, that they had judges, and that this was their affair. They answered that their judges were aristocrats, and that they did not punish the guilty." That is to say, although the priests were non-jurors, and therefore criminals in the eye of the law, the courts would not enforce the law because of the political bias. "It is your fault," I said to them, "since you elected them the judges, but that is no reason why you should do justice yourselves." Danton explained in the convention that it was because of the deep distrust of the judiciary in the public mind, which this anecdote shows, that the September massacres occurred, and it was because all Republicans knew that the state and the army were full of traitors like Dumouriez, whom the ordinary courts would not punish, that Danton brought forward his bill to organize a true political tribunal to deal with them summarily. When Danton carried through this statute he supposed himself to be at the apex of power and popularity, and to be safe if any man in France were safe. Very shortly he learned the error in his calculation. Billaud, who was a member of the Committee of Public Safety, while Danton had allowed himself to be dropped from membership. Danton had just been married, and to an aristocratic wife, and the turmoil of office had grown to be distasteful to him. On March 30, 1794, Billaud somewhat casually remarked, "We must kill Danton," for in truth Danton, with conservative leanings, was becoming a grave danger to the extreme Jacobians. Had he lived a few months longer, he would have been a Thermidorist. Billaud therefore only expressed the prevailing Jacobin opinion, so the Jacobins arrested Danton. Camille Desmoulins and his other friends and Danton at once anticipated what would be his doom. As he entered his cell, he said to his jailer, "I erected the tribunal. I ask pardon of God and men." But even yet he did not grasp the full meaning of what he had done. At his trial he wished to introduce his evidence fully, protesting that he should understand the tribunal since he created it. Nevertheless, he did not understand the tribunal. He still regarded it as more or less a court. Topino Lebrun, the artist, did understand it. Topino sat on the jury which tried Danton and observed that the heart of one of his colleagues seemed failing him. Topino took the waverer aside and said, "This is not a trial, it is a measure. 2 men are impossible, one must perish. Will you kill Robespierre? No, then by that admission you condemn Danton." Lebrun in these few words went to the root of the matter, and stated the identical principle which underlies our whole doctrine of the police power. A political court is not properly a court at all, but an administrative board whose function is to work the will of the dominant faction for the time being. Thus a political court becomes the most formidable of all engines for the destruction of its creators the instant the social equilibrium shifts. So Danton found in the spring of 1794 when the equilibrium shifted, and so Robespierre, who slew Danton, found the next July when the equilibrium shifted again. Danton died on the 5th April, 1794. About 3 months later, Jourdan won the Fleurist campaign. Straightway Thermidor followed, and the tribunal worked as well for the party of Thermidor as it had for the Jacobins. Carrier, who had wallowed in blood at Nantes as the ideal Jacobin, walked behind the cart which carried Robespierre to the scaffold, shouting, "Down with the tyrant!" but that did not save him. In vain he protested to the Convention that were he guilty the whole Convention was guilty, down to the President's bell. By a vote of 498 out of 500, Carrier was sent before the tribunal, which, even though reorganized, condemned him. Theresia Cabarrus gaily presided at the closing of the Jacobin Club. Tallien moved over to the benches on the right, and therefore the court was ruthless to Fouquet. On the 11th Thermidor, 70 members, officers or partisans of the Commune of Paris, were sent to the guillotine in only 2 batches. On the next day 12 more followed, 4 of whom were jurymen. Fouquet's turn came later. It may also be worth while for Americans to observe that a political court is quite as effective against property as against life. The Duke of Orleans is only the most celebrated example of a host of Frenchmen who perished, not because of revenge, fear, or jealousy, but because the party in power wanted their property. The famous law touching suspected persons, Loi des Suspects, was passed on September 17, 1793. On October 10, 1793, that is 3 weeks afterward, Saint Just moved that additional powers should be granted by the Convention to the Committee of Public Safety, defining by way of justification for his motion those who fell within the purview of this law. Among these first of all came the rich, who by that fact alone were to be considered prima facie enemies to their country. As I stated at the beginning of this chapter, history never can repeat itself, therefore, whatever else may happen in the United States, we certainly shall have no revolutionary tribunal like the French tribunal of 1793. But the mechanical principle of the political court always remains the same. It is an administrative board, the control of which is useful, or may be even essential to the success of a dominant faction, and the instinctive comprehension which the American people have of this truth is demonstrated by the determination with which they have for many years sought to impose the will of the majority upon the judiciary. Other means failing to meet their expectations, they have now hit on the recall, which as revolutionary in essence as were the methods used during the Terror. Courts from the Supreme Court downward, if purged by recall, or a process tantamount to recall, would, under proper stress, work as surely for a required purpose as did the tribunal supervised by Fouquet Tinville. These considerations rather lead me to infer that the extreme complexity of the administrative problems presented by modern industrial civilization is beyond the compass of the capitalistic mind. If this be so, American society, as at present organized, with capitalists for the dominant class, can concentrate no further and, as nothing in the universe is at rest, if it does not concentrate, it must, probably, begin to disintegrate.